All right, good. Welcome everyone to the Gulf Coast Prairie Landscape Conservation Cooperative Lunchtime Webinar Series for August 2016. My name is Ben Kaler, and I'm the Science Coordinator for the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC. Before we begin, I have a couple of notes about how the webinar will be conducted today. First, it's being recorded. Also, we're in auditorium style, which means that you've all been muted regardless if you've dialed in or are using your computer's microphone and speakers. Please submit any questions that you have in the chat box. Also, we'll take questions at the end, so there will be time, and we encourage you to ask questions after the presentation. Also, if you would, you'll notice that there's a poll question, and we're going to open that. And I'd like you all to respond to it. This will give us a sense of the primary role you play in your job. So if you take just about 30 seconds, we'll get some answers here just to get a sense of the primary role you play in your job.
Is good. We've got almost 80% of the folks have responded. Close the poll in another.
We're going to close the poll in about 10 seconds. Thank you all who've responded. All right, thank you. The Gulf Coast Prairie.
The results.
Okay. All right, good. I'm glad to see that the folks in the room are probably those who are going to find this information very useful. So I'm glad you all are here.
So Wes, we have about 38% are water quality, flow, aquatic organism research, 24% are involved in water policy decisions, 19% in land management or extension, and 19% in other.
Great, thank you, Greg. So the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC is a collaborative science support partnership working to deliver sustainable natural and cultural resource conservation in the Gulf Coast Prairie geography by sharing scientific knowledge, leveraging resources, and working towards common landscape goals. The LCC chose 28 focal species that represent 17 broadly defined habitats in order to define and design long-term landscape conservation to achieve the mission of the partnership. And in August 2014, the steering committee approved our LCC science strategy, which identified the most critical science needs for 6 of these focal species. One of these top-tier focal species is really a suite of several species of freshwater mussels that were chosen to represent headwaters and streams and rivers and oxbow lakes. Today we're joined by Dr. Wesley Daniel with Michigan State University's Department of Fisheries and Wildlife in East Lansing, Michigan. In just a moment, Dr. Daniel will talk to us about a project that we funded to address the greatest science need for the focal freshwater mussel species. Before he takes the floor, I'd like to briefly introduce him. Dr. Wesley Daniel is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at Michigan State. He received his doctorate from Louisiana State University, and his dissertation focused on modeling the influence of significant human and natural variables on unionid mussel assemblages in southern Louisiana. He's published 9 peer-reviewed manuscripts in the last 4 years on unionid mussel ecology and life history, including the first documented known host fishes for purple pimpleback. I'd also like to note the absence of Dr. Dana Infante, an associate professor in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at Michigan State, who is unfortunately unable to join us today. Although we know her absence here, we acknowledge her strong role in the effort at hand. I'd also like to note the presence of Elizabeth Throckmorton, a research technician and master's student at Michigan State, who's also been very instrumental in the effort. So without further ado, Dr. Daniel, we welcome you. You have control of the webinar, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate the opportunity to present and show all the project in its entirety. Today we're going to talk about the development and support of this conservation plan and all the work we put in to help the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC with conserving Quadrula species within the region. So a brief outline of the talk, just kind of going over the general need for this conservation plan and what makes these priority Quadrula species so special within the region, and then going through each of our project objectives, starting with the systematic literature review, and then kind of going out of order because I feel like this gives us a little better story to tell, talking about the creation of the Gulf Coast Prairie Mussel Database, and then the second objective, looking at the stakeholder webinars and the inputs that we received during those webinars from our regional experts. And then finally, the final report. So freshwater mussels within the United States are incredibly diverse, and the Southeast United States support the most diversity on Earth. And the unionids are an essential part of our riverine ecosystems. They often dominate our benthic biomass and are essential components of the food web influencing nutrient cycling. Mussels often dominate and provide a critical link between the pelagic and benthic food webs, filtering bacteria and other organisms along with organic matter from the water and providing some of that material back into the sediments. These deposits are often utilized by macrovertebrates and fishes. Mussel shells have also been shown to stabilize sediments and provide habitat and refugia for other aquatic organisms. Further, freshwater mussels are an important cultural value since they're both part of North America's natural history and been historically used by Native Americans for food and the shells for ornamentation, tools, and trade. Unionids also have the distinction of being one of the most endangered groups of freshwater organisms in the U.S. Of the approximate 300 native species, about 25 are extinct, 40% are federally threatened or endangered, and another 24% are considered imperiled at some level. There are numerous factors contributing to the decline of freshwater mussels, and I listed just a few here. These are specifically important for the region: historical overharvest, water pollution and water quality, land use alteration, and increased utilization of water resources for municipal and agricultural purposes. The Gulf Coast LCC identified Quadrula as its priority genus as part of their sensitivity to water quality and quantity, and as a part of their mission to protect and sustain and conserve the natural cultural resources of the region. And so they make them akin to the proverbial canary in the coal mine, being some of the first to respond negatively to alterations within a system. The other thing that makes Quadrula species unique is there are clear lack of knowledge on a lot of these species' life history, current distribution, and ecology. And without this information, it's hard to understand how specific threats will affect these mussels over the region and over different spatial scales, which really limits our ability to manage them. So, as Ben pointed out, the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC funded this project to combine both current information from a systematic literature review with expert knowledge to be used in support of the development of a conservation plan for Quadrula species. The priority Quadrula species, which I'm referring to, includes 8 species. And the first thing you might notice on here is that there's only one of these species that is truly a Quadrula at this time. Now, all of these species at one time were in the Quadrula genus, but recent advances in genetics and taxonomic work on these species has moved them to new genera. But for this project, we're still refer to the group of species as Quadrula. Within the 8 species that were selected, there were 5 that were a priori selected as focal species by the Gulf Coast Prairie, included the winged maple leaf, the warty back, the smooth pimpleback, the Texas pimpleback, and golden orb. And these species do represent 2 different distribution types. The 4 on the left are Mississippi River Basin distributed species that can be found throughout the Midwest and up to the Great Lakes. And the 4 on the right are species that are endemic only to central and eastern Texas. So getting into our first objective of this project was the systematic literature review. So the project team conducted a systematic literature review, consolidating articles about priority Quadrula species from 1980 to 2015 using peer-reviewed journals, state wildlife action plans for the 3 focal states of Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma, and gray literature from state and federal agencies. The review concentrated on amassing literature about the distribution, life history, ecology, and the conservation needs both of the priority Quadrula species, but other unionid mussels within the region, and including sympatric species of interest, which would be any other species that co-occur with these priority Quadrula species. At the end of this review, we had amassed over 1,000 articles from manuscripts, reports, books, and internet sources, and all of this information has been included in an EndNote reference list and provided as a deliverable. Some of the sources of the literature can be found on this slide. We had 177 peer-reviewed journals and gray literature sources. This includes the most recent state wildlife action plans for Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. The figure shows all journals and books with greater than 10 references within the EndNote reference list, with the American Malological Bulletin with the greatest number of references with 71. We also included 84 books, book chapters, and other miscellaneous sources within this 1,000 EndNote reference list. As a part of the literature review, we also wanted to create an annotated bibliography from a subset of the articles, and so we developed a process to select these particular articles for this annotations. From the literature search, we selected 5 criteria to select particular articles of interest that would be of use both in the final report and directly to creation of this conservation plan. Any literature about the priority Quadrula species themselves, any research conducted in the Gulf Coast Prairie region, including Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma, information on mussel site location and management actions. These were data sources that were used to mine information to be included in the Gulf Coast Prairie Mussel Database. Any literature authorship by regional experts, and which included research done by Karen Vaughn from University of Oklahoma, Kenneth Brown, retired from Louisiana State University, Charles Rancliffe from Texas A&M University, Neil Ford from University of Texas Tyler, Wendell Haig from the U.S. Forest Service, Bob Howells, retired from Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and Malcolm Badrine from Louisiana State University at Eunice. In total, we created 157 annotations in the bibliography. So the whole point of the literature review was to come up with some answers on what literature is available for each of these species. And so the next 2 sets of tables is a general boiling down of what we found, considering life history, habitat use, and major threats for our 8 priority Quadrula species. We can see are the unbolded ones on the top are those Mississippi drainage species, and the bolded ones are those Texas endemic at the bottom. And you can see a pretty clear separation when looking at this life history information. Many of the Mississippi drainage species, which are also threatened within their northern distribution within Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the upper Midwest, have a lot more information and literature available for them than the Texas endemics do, which only occur in central and eastern Texas. So there is some need here for a lot of information about a lot of these Texas endemics. When also thinking about distribution, habitat use, and major threats, we still see there is some clear need on research. Host fish especially as being an important part of the life history of freshwater mussels. We see the upper Midwest and Mississippi drainage species have a lot of information about host fish, but the Texas endemics is still quite lacking. The current distribution is thought of being well understood, but I can definitely see where areas of more survey work can be done. Habitat use is relatively understood. And there's not really been a lot of major research done on the specific threats to an individual species, in the sense that there have been a lot of kind of allegorical kind of things that looked at where they kind of noticed variation in habitat use, but no real direct studies have been conducted at this time, really looking at what threats are influencing these particular species occurrences and abundances. So as I said, taking these objectives out of order just to kind of tell a little better, story. Our third objective was the creation of the Gulf Coast Prairie Mussel Database. The project team created a spatial database depicting current unionid mussel site locations and abundance data when available, as well as locations of management actions associated with these unionid mussels. And by management actions, we were kind of considering what was the purpose of the data being collected. Was it a survey, relocation, potentially augmentation from a bred or a hatchery-raised species? All this data came from literature sources or publicly available databases. It's all existing data. We did not create any of it, but we did link all the data to a single spatial framework. The spatial framework is described by Wang et al. In 2011. It's the NAC plus V1 system, which uses a stream reach as its spatial unit. A stream reach can be defined simply as a confluence-to-confluence stretch of stream. So it has some ecological meaning to the segmentation of these units. There were 55 literature articles that contain ample information to be used and taking the information out for site location information. And we were provided data by 4 database providers, including the Texas Parks and Wildlife, the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, Oklahoma Department of Wildlife and Conservation, and then we also mined individual Quadrula species locations from the USGS Bison database. So I wanted to show a few of these maps. These maps will show species occurrence both inside and outside of the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC region. We also have point locations outside of the 3 focal states of Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma, but we just not include them on the maps for today. We have 2 types of data within the database. We have a point location represented by the circles that are bolded on the edge. And then we have segmented regions, which is occurrence where a stretch or river was identified as being occurrence instead of a site location. For the winged maple leaf, we have 73 records of occurrence. Within the Gulf Coast Prairie region, you see most of them occurring in Oklahoma, well, all of them occurring in Oklahoma within the Little Creek Basin. And this is one of the 2 viable populations that are suspected to occur in North America, with the other being in the St. Croix in Minnesota, Wisconsin. For the wartyback, we have 23 occurrences within our database. The wartyback can be found in Texas in the Sabine and Sulphur and Cypress River basins, not limited to just those runs, but those are ones that are represented. In Oklahoma, it can be found in the lower Arkansas, the Red River Basin, and the Verdigris River Basin. And in Louisiana, it can be found in the Red, the Sabine, the Calcasieu, and in the Pontchartrain Lake Basin. Our second 2 Mississippi River Basin species are the monkey face and rabbit's foot. The monkey face has 73 occurrences within our database. In Louisiana, we can find it in the Bayou Bartholomew. Oklahoma, again, in the Little River Basin and the Arkansas River Basin. The rabbit foot, we have 125 occurrences, and it occurs in a lot of the similar habitats as the monkey face. The rabbit foot is also found in the Bayou Bartholomew in Louisiana and the Little River and Arkansas River Basins in Oklahoma. Now to move on to our Central and East Texas endemics. Both of these species are highly cryptic, the golden orb and smooth pimpleback. And there's a lot of thought that a few of the golden orb occurrences are misidentified as smooth, are actually smooth pimpleback. So for these species, any occurrence outside the known historical distribution have been flagged as questionable identification by the purple. Now, in creating these databases, we never want to delete data. We always want to maintain it just for potential future use. And so these have just been flagged for further review. And so for the golden orb, we have 181 occurrences. Most of those occurrences, or of course all those occurrences, are in Texas, and they occur in the Guadalupe and Natchez Frio River basins. The smooth pimpleback, we have 217 occurrences, our highest occurrence for our priority Quadrilla. And we can see the smooth pimpleback occurs in the Brazos and Colorado River basins. For other 2 Central and Eastern Texas endemics, the false spike has the least amount of occurrences with 17. It's found in the Guadalupe, the Colorado, and the Brazos rivers. And the Texas pimpleback has 99 occurrences, and it occurs in the main stem and tributaries of the Colorado, the Guadalupe, and the San Antonio River Basin. Now, in addition to just the mussel site location, we were also provided landscape data for the Gulf Coast Prairie region for the 3 priority states. And this information was provided by the National Fish Habitat Partnership. Much of the threat variables were used in the creation of their 2015 inland assessment, and we were providing it in whole as part of a decision support system that potentially the Gulf Coast Prairie could use into the future. We did create 3 new disturbance variables specifically for this project: a zebra mussel distribution within the region, a 6-foot sea level rise from a NOAA database, and then current drought conditions from 2016. So just an example of how this information can be utilized, if we take the known occurrences of the Texas pimpleback and smooth pimpleback, we can overlay them with some of this other information to help us identify important areas of conservation. For example, if we overlay those locations with the Protected Areas Database, which are areas that are managed for biodiversity, along with our National Fish Habitat Partnership Fish Habitat Assessment results, really focusing on the areas of low risk of habitat degradation, which are represented by the purple and blue, while the red and orange are areas of very high risk of habitat degradation. And if you look at the map, you can clearly see Houston and Dallas-Fort Worth stand out within those big red areas. So if we combine the Protected Areas Database along with those point locations and our NFHAP, National Fish Habitat Partnership assessment results, we can identify high quality stream reaches, which are low risk of habitat degradation, that are without protection at this point, but do contain both either smooth pimpleback or Texas pimpleback. And so these might be areas that of high protection value. So moving on to Objective 2, we conducted 2 stakeholder webinars to elicit feedback from regional experts. We invited experts and stakeholders from the regional LCC groups, the universities, state, and federal agencies. From these webinars, we were eliciting information about literature suggestions, availability of data to integrate into the mussel database, ranking the perceived most important current and future threats to the priority Quadrula species, again, because there is little literature on those influence those threats, identifying research needs for conserving the priority Quadrula species, and then identifying what management actions could be taken to potentially eliminate threats to priority Quadrula species. Just for the sake of time, I'll be presenting some of these results, but all of this information is available within the final report. So when thinking about the current and future threats to mussels, as I stated earlier, there are numerous threats to freshwater mussels across the U.S., and the project team identified 13 current and 12 future categories of threats, which are most often cited within the literature as being the cause of declines. We conducted 2 surveys to elicit feedback about these threats. The first one was with the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC webinar group with a web-based survey. But then I also took an opportunity at the Freshwater Mussels Conservation Society workshop within West Virginia to do an in-person survey asking about general thoughts about freshwater mussels in the U.S. and what are the most important threats to them. The participants were all asked to rank the top 5 threats to current and future mussel assemblages. So some of the stakeholder feedback we received for current threats, you can see the top 3 were the same between the Gulf Coast Prairie and the Freshwater Mussels Conservation Society participants. Hydrologic and channel alteration being the most important, along with anthropogenic land use and fragmentation by dams and road crossings. From there, we kind of get some divergence between the Gulf Coast Prairie participants and the general FMCS, but you can see that we used an overall importance grouping to kind of lump a lot of these categories together. When thinking about future threats, we have, again, a lot of similarity between the Gulf Coast Prairie and the FMCS. For land use change and climate change, we're not 1 and 2 for both. But then again, we got some separation between the 2 groups with new infrastructure and drought being a third most important within the Gulf Coast Prairie group, and human population growth being more important for the freshwater mollusk conservation group. One of the things we've stressed so far after the literature reviews, there's a lot of need for research. And so we asked the stakeholders what was the most priority when we're thinking towards research. So we developed a list of research needs based off the state wildlife action plans for Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, and the national strategy for freshwater mollusk. And we developed a list of 13 research needs and asked again to all the survey takers to rank them related to the general needs of filling the knowledge gaps and how potentially emerging threats might influence mussel populations. So this is the ranking by the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC members, and they identified the need for understanding life history traits and the known host fish as being the #1 need within the region, with second to identifying ecological flow requirements for freshwater mussels. The fourth large feedback was about conservation actions, and we created a list of 11 potential conservation actions that could be undertaken by management agencies to address current and future impacts of freshwater mussels to conserve or restore mussel habitat. These again were identified from the state wildlife action plans and the national strategy for freshwater mollusks. For each conservation action, we asked the LCC stakeholders to identify the ways that action could improve or eliminate the threats for freshwater mussels. And then we lumped these into 4 response groups. The highest agreement amongst participants, which would be greater than 80% of the survey takers, agreed that the particular action would help improve or eliminate a threat. 50 to 80% of agreement, 0 to 50% are then not selected. Now, these results I will not be presenting today because it's a very large table, but can be seen within the final report. So for our last objective, it was, of course, the final report itself. The project team created a final report to document all the recommendations and all the information that we found within this project. This includes a systematic review of the literature, focusing on both the current literature, the state wildlife action plans, and any kind of local conservation efforts focused on unionid mussels within the Gulf Coast Prairie region. We also consolidated all the input provided by the participants of the 2 webinars, and then made some recommendations for future conservation priorities. The final report content can be seen here. In addition to all that information, we've also provided general introduction to unionids, a lot of information about them, broke down each of the Quadrula species into their own section, describing their status, a description of the unionid, life history and ecology knowledge, what's available, known host fish, current known distribution, and habitat use. We also created a list of sympatric species of interest from state SGCN list, and then wrote up some information about current and future threats of freshwater mussels, and then finally the conservation actions, and then our recommendations. For today, I'm just going to focus on some of the recommendations we developed from the final report. As the Gulf Coast Prairie stakeholders have acknowledged, research is needed, and the specific threats to Quadrula and their life history are 2 of the more prominent lacking knowledge gaps we have right now about these species, including flow requirements, which is really important in a region that experiences frequent droughts. And as climate scenarios have suggested, the region will also experience more frequent droughts. And with the population growth within Texas, there's a real potential issue with providing water both for human needs with the increase in demand and for maintaining ecological flows. So understanding flow requirements is an important step, as well as understanding climate conditions and how they might influence populations. We also feel that management should focus on maintaining these highly suitable patches where the current populations occur. Conserving an entire ecosystem would be the most effective for managing freshwater mussel assemblages, but this option is improbable based on land ownership in the region. So we really recommend aggressively protecting the patches where these species currently occur and protecting them from local or upstream threats. and when opportunities occur, restore or maintaining our maintenance of the sites to improve mussel habitat conditions. By taking this kind of broader habitat approach, we're not only going to be able to conserve the Quadrula populations, but all other sympatric mussel species there, and making sure that those species also do not become imperiled. We feel that the recovery and protection of the natural population should be the priority, that we should resist augmenting with propagation programs unless absolutely necessary, and trying to limit the fragmentation within the watersheds to retain the metapopulation dynamics between all these populations within these watersheds. Now, we do recognize that for some of these Quadrula populations, laboratory propagation may be the only conservation action available to reintroduce to new locations or even maintain current population numbers. The most important step, I think, though, is going to be outreach, which I think the Gulf Coast Prairie has done an excellent job on, because none of the actions that can be taken today are going to produce rapid recovery of these mussel populations. And a vast majority of the habitats where these species occupy are privately owned. So there needs to be continued public support, both for the research and funding for conserving these species into the future. But I would like to stress, even though we don't have all the answers today, the critical status of these populations necessitates that we use the best available information at hand to attempt to conserve the Quadrula species and not wait for all the answers to be available. So a quick wrap up of the project deliverables. The literature review produced 1,000 articles in the EndNote reference list, which has been provided, and we created 157 annotations in the bibliography from those articles. The Gulf Coast Prairie Mussel Database contains 4 databases worth of information on the priority Quadrula species and species of sympatric species, including Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, and then the bison database from USGS, along with 55 literature sources linked to the single spatial framework. Within that database, we have 83 species of mussels represented and 722 sample locations. We've also included landscape data for the Gulf Coast LCUC region. We, of course, included all the stakeholder feedback we provided to us by the 2 webinars, and then the final report. So at this time, I'd like to acknowledge the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC and thank them for funding this effort. We'd like to thank Ben and Cynthia for all their assistance and support during this project, and all the participants of the first and second webinars and the valuable feedback they provided. There were a lot of people that helped us along the way to obtain data, including Mark Howery, Todd Fagan, Karen Vaughn, and Nicole Lorenz. And we like to thank those agencies that provided the data. Again, Texas Parks and Wildlife, Louisiana Park and Wildlife and Fisheries, Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation, the USGS Bison Database, and for the landscape data, the National Fish Habitat Partnership. I'd like to thank the numerous FMCS participants that took time out of drinking beer to answer some questions about current and future threats of freshwater mussels, and then all the GIS contributions from Kyle Harriman. So at this time, I am open to any questions.
Okay, this is Greg. I'm going to go ahead and launch this last poll question that we had, and then we've had one question submitted, and this is also a reminder, if you have a question, to submit your question in the chat box. This question is, to what extent could the results of this effort contribute to conservation or recovery plans for freshwater mussels? So we have about 70% of the folks have voted. We'll leave it open for like another 10 seconds or so. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So we show that 50% of folks think that this would definitely be useful for recovery plans in Texas. 21% say yes in Oklahoma, 17% say yes in Louisiana, and 54% say somewhat in some or all of these states. Nobody thinks that they're not going to be useful, so that's good. And then I don't know if you can see it, Wes, but there was one question that I sent to you in the chat from Bob Gottfried, and I could, if he is available, I can unmute him and let him ask his question.
Sounds good.
Bob, are you there?
Hello?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, my question was, in creating the database, and I'm sure this was part of the project, but was there any consideration, why did you decide to create a brand new database instead of partnering with the Heritage Network programs in all of those states which are using the exact, or using a similar database to each other and are already charged with making that data available to users and researchers?
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate that comment. So in a sense, we did partner with them because they provided all this information directly to us. One of the advantages is we were able to not only use their information, but the information mined from the literature to gain additional species locations. What the one advantage of combining them all into a single spatial framework is they're readily usable at this time. If the LCC wanted to conduct any type of assessment, all that data is ready to go at this point.
Okay, thanks, Bob, for your question. At this point, we don't have any more questions that were submitted. Actually, wait. We have a question just coming in from Sandy Birnbaum. She says, how will the database be maintained?
That's an excellent question, and one actually for Ben, because the way that we've formatted this, it is completely open for editing and additions. So Ben, are you on the line?
Yeah, I am. The Gulf Coast Prairie, we have a conservation planning atlas, otherwise known as a CPA, and it's a public open mapping application where we have lots of different data sets pooled from various sources, and you can there are analytical capabilities in it, and there's also export functions, and it's not our intent, nor do we want to serve up this information in any way that could pinpoint specific locations down to a XY coordinate. What we're planning on doing is serving up this information at a Huck 12 scale to say that there is presence or abundance of these types of mussels across the GCP. And just to join with that, this effort's been giving us a snapshot of what do we know, what records are out there, and there's a separate effort underway right now within Texas, out of Texas A&M, IRNR, and Dr. Charles Radcliffe, and a similar type of analysis and pulling records together from that laboratory, and we're very hopeful that this effort and the efforts out of Texas A&M could help inform recovery planning or conservation planning for these species across not just the Gulf Coast Prairie, but also adjacent regions, particularly the Mississippi River drainage. And so as far as long-term maintenance, at this time we don't have any plans to make it something that we add things to regularly, much like a heritage program does. We're using this as the snapshot, what do we know right now, and use that to help inform efforts right now, and also inform the creation or the revision of conservation and recovery plans for these species. So Wes, I have one question I'd like to ask you.
Please.
Is that those who are very familiar with Texas and Oklahoma and to a lesser extent Louisiana, is that a lot of the major rivers, even a lot of the small rivers, are highly impacted. There's a high prevalence of more stagnant pools of water in reservoirs, and those might not be as conducive given the life history requirements of these species. And what I'm trying to get at is for these Texas endemics, if we're looking at these records in situ and intersecting that with National Fish Habitat Assessment information, what would you say are the biggest risks for these Texas endemics for persistence or prevalence? Is it the alteration of flow, or is it the alteration and flow in that pulling things up, or is it more of the risk of flooding events that may scour sediments, or are those things kind of related?
Those are actually completely related, and it's not as simple as pointing to one, but I do think hydraulic alteration altogether, both the changing into impounded areas, which have shown that most Quadrula period don't do very well in impounded areas, with only one kind of oddball occurrence in Lake Corpus Christi. And but also, you're right, the scouring events have shown to below dams and such not have shown to be very detrimental also. I think as we move into the future within Texas with the very large population increases which are projected, water demand is going to become even more important. Then you might see additional reservoirs being built for storage, which can impact additional populations that are currently not impacted. Or you could see potentially headwaters being dewatered during summertime periods or low flow periods because of demands downstream. So hydrology altogether within the region is a major concern.
Great. Well, I think from my standpoint, having done a very extensive literature review giving us a sense of what is known for these species and a sense of where the known occurrence records are, I think gives us possible avenues for really drilling down into the what are the next most important research needs that have been identified, but also it might inform further survey efforts for looking at between locations that may have clusters of occurrence records, might give us information on where we might look next. So from that standpoint, I really enjoyed the results from this effort. I think it may add some value to efforts across the landscape out there.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. So we don't have any other questions. So I'd just like to thank everyone for coming on and those who asked questions. Certainly, thank you, Dr. Daniel and Dr. Infante and Elizabeth Throckmorton for all your work here. I'd just like to mention that we do these webinars once a month. Next month, we'll have a webinar on Wednesday, September 7th, also at noon Central, and it'll be on a northern bobwhite fragmentation study that's been conducted at Texas A&M Kingsville. So for all of you who are interested in bobwhite, circle back next month and look for the announcement. So thank you all for your time, and I hope you have a really great day.